Welcome, everybody. I'm Gene Colman. Colleague Brian Ludmer is also here, and we are presenting on the title that you see on the screen. We are both family law lawyers. I was called to the Ontario Bar in 1979, and Brian was called 1986, Brian?
87.
87. And we have both done a fair number of parental alienation cases, both in court and out. Brian, much more so than me. Empowering boys and men, promoting wellness and relationships. That's the title of this conference, where the father-child relationship has been disrupted. Of course, we want to restore the relationship to a healthy status. We want to promote wellness, to harken back to the title of this conference, and hopefully Brian and I will be able to shed some light on a highly controversial and indeed emotional topic. Hopefully, our insights and experience that we share with you this morning will constitute at least a modest step to promote some degree of empowering dads and kids, and in that process serve to promote wellness and relationships, again, the theme of the conference. When professionals and laypersons, for that matter, examine fractured relationships, we surely want to devise a rehabilitative plan of action. It is important to understand causation, to understand family dynamics, to understand just how we got to the dysfunctional status of a fractured father-child bond. We are obliged to critically analyze the situation. Only then can we come up with a treatment plan, whether that plan involves mental health professionals, lawyers, and courts, are both. And now Brian will continue.
Okay, thank you, Gene. The concept of parental alienation should not be controversial. It's just a label. It's a label that we attach to a complex series of family interactions. Think of a matrix between parents, parents and one child, child to child, one parent and two children versus the other parent. And if we look at the pre-separation dynamic and then the post-separation dynamic, and we're able to conclude that the primary, not the sole, but the primary causality of the family dysfunction is one parent trying to control or manipulate or position the children against the other parent. We need a label to describe that, to make it simpler to discuss, to form an image in our mind that will then inform remedies. And so this term parental alienation has been applied to that conclusionary observation of what the primary, not the singular, cause of the family dysfunction appears to be. The term was not invented by Dr. Gardner in the mid to late 80s. The term was observed for a couple of hundred years, going back to the early 1800s, and some well-noted US and UK family law litigation, and reported in the newspapers because these were primarily the wealthy families of the day. So the term goes back there. Albert Einstein, in and around 1909, 1910, famously complained bitterly that he was being alienated from his children. Other theoreticians, using different terminology to describe the same thing, published in the 50s and 60s and 70s. The 70s into the 80s saw the development of, from the psychological science community, of a concept called triangulation, pathological alliance, and those concepts of the family as a system and how it's functioning in a maladaptive way are part of mainstream psychology today. They are beyond debate. So the unfortunate politicization of this concept is entirely misplaced. It is just a label to describe a conclusionary observation of what broke a family system. And it is amply understood in the scientific literature, in the legal jurisprudence, for a couple of 100 years. Those who don't like the remedies or leveling the playing field as a result of that conclusion are trying to attack the concept. Thankfully, in Canada in particular, but also in countries around the world, this is a settled concept in the jurisprudence. And just to give you a visual, Jean, if you could click on our first hyperlink in B. And hopefully this will then open up and occupy the screen. Jean may need to drag another screen over the top, or because it may open up on a different screen. But essentially,
wait, Brian, sorry, Brian, you don't see it?
No.
Let me see if I.
Because a different browser window may have opened up.
Yes, all right.
So if you could just drag it onto the screen there. Okay, yeah, you have to stop sharing that one. And
that's my daughter, and I'm going to share with the link there. Hang on. And where is it?
Okay, so I'll just keep going while you find it. So what's going to show on the screen in a second is a legal research memo about what is parental alienation. All right, suffice it to say, it's fine that there is a hypertext link there where the pointer is on this screen. It's okay, Jean, we'll just go with this. And you'll have a detailed legal brief with its own links to the public jurisprudence that shows how well accepted this concept is in our law. Now, it would still be neat if we had one concise description, because it took me 2-3 minutes to kind of describe what this is. And the best one that I've ever seen in my travels is, again, and Jean, we'll just keep going, is at the second hypertext link at the end of line B, a 2011 Manitoba case where a psychologist named Dr. Stanbrook testified and gave a 3-paragraph long description of what it is. And it is also absolutely untouchable in terms of the politicized debate that is going on these days. Took me a long time, but I finally got some Ontario judges to adopt Dr. Stanbrook's, I'm immortalizing Dr. Stanbrook here because it's the best one I've ever seen in any country. And it has now snowballed. So the best definition, and it's an untouchable definition scientifically, you will find dates back to this case at this hyperlink. The hyperlink takes you to Canley, and you'll be able to see it for yourself, and it has been picked up in multiple other cases. So point C, do you need to hire an expert? Jean, just go back to the PowerPoint and just leave it. We won't bother clicking on anything. All the links work. So for everybody attending, you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint, and we've checked, all the links work. You'll have access to all the documents that I'm referring to here, okay? So thankfully, one of the cases that I argued at trial and defended successfully at the Court of Appeal in point C, AM versus CH, has definitively stated that this is simply a factual determination. It's a label. Therefore, the implications are you don't need an expert. Not everybody can afford, and there are few experts who can speak definitively to the diagnostic criteria, which I'm going to quickly address shortly. And so AM versus CH is the high water mark of saying, just prove your case factually. What's the primary causal factor of the family dysfunction? Most other provinces follow Ontario. British Columbia is an outlier. There's a British Columbia Court of Appeal case from 2016, I would say, Williamson, which is an outlier. But as to whether, and Williamson has been rejected by courts of appeal in other provinces which are following AM versus CH, whether Williamson is still good law in light of the 2021 amendments to our family law legislation, bringing in the concept of coercive control, remains to be seen. But I am heading out to Kelowna on Sunday to do a 4-week trial in BC. And this will be one of the issues, so watch this space. So is there any rigors? It's simply you make your pitch as to the causal factors, and a judge decides just like any other factual finding. Well, thankfully, there is some help. That's point D. There's no one universal set of criteria, but there are scientifically recognized sets of criteria that we look at. And obviously, if your fact pattern fits the criteria in several of the models that we'll look at, that's a pretty robust way of proving your thesis and disproving the opposing thesis that the extreme behavior of the children is justified, and this is what Jean and I are going to be speaking to in the balance of this presentation, somehow justified by such impaired, such brutal parenting by one parent that somehow an utter complete rejection by children is the logical outcome of the family history. So what can we look to? There's the 5-factor model. This was originally the 4-factor model is essentially Dr. Gardner, who was a clinician, child psychologist, and very successful in helping families, and had this group of families that no matter what he did, applying all his experience and expertise, he couldn't help them. They just were immune and immutable. And so he said, I got to study these. Is it me? Am I doing something wrong? How come I can't reach these families the way I have other families? And that study of the families that refused to heal is what led to Dr. Gardner's thesis of how we diagnose that the primary causal factor is harmful and manipulative actions by one parent. That science was revalidated by work done by Dr. Amy Baker and the late Dr. Darnall in the US, going back 15 to 20 years. That became the 4-factor model. The 4-factor model became the 5-factor model with some input from Dr. William Bernay, who's the founder and chair of PASG. And Jean is going to be speaking to what we refer to as the Gardnerian model that is today manifested by the 5-factor model. Point F, another model heavily based on the science of suggestibility and brainwashing of children, was published by 2 psychologists, Stanley Clowar, and I forget Rivlin's first name, in a rather thick book, a study of 1,000 families done for the American Bar Association. And that book, I think, is out of print now, but still readily available, well worth buying. Dr. Craig Childress in California has espoused an attachment theory, all the rage in psychology, mainstream psychology, for how you assess a family. He has a website filled with resources, well worth spending some time there kicking around. So he has his thesis that you can simply by observing a pattern of behavior without even really focusing too much on what the parents are doing. There's some artificiality from a scientific perspective that just pops right out. Some wonderful resources on that website. Now, the critics will often say, because the term, the buzzword, the label, parental alienation, does not appear in any official published nomenclature in any of the definitive publications, that means it doesn't exist. That's wrong. All you have to do is go back to our buddy, Dr. Stanbrook. He says that. It's irrelevant that it's not to be found in any published official standards, because the dynamic exists and has been well known in relational psychology, etc. But there are, in the latest iteration of the DSM, the Bible of Psychological Disorders, several categories that, even though the term is not mentioned, when you read the diagnosis, it covers what we colloquially call PA, and I've given you 3 of the codes here. An article was published jointly by Dr. Bernay, who I mentioned, and the 2 psychologists who were the publishers of this part of the DSM-5, under the title, the last one, Child Affected by Parental Relationship Distress. And they said, the publishers of this part of the DSM-5, yes, we meant to cover PA. So there's an article that they jointly published called Carp D that you can find online. The evolution of our law now, it picks up coercive control, and Jean has given a prior presentation, I think, at last year's conference on that. And then some of the things that Jean is going to now look at, what are we looking for practically in the children's behavior, in the parents' behavior, inform our ultimate conclusion in the application of this label. Jean, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Brian touched on the 5-factor model, and here we have it up on the screen now. This is sort of the overall framework when we are dealing with a child who unreasonably rejects contact with one parent. Number 1, the child manifests contact resistance or refusal. Secondly, there was a prior positive relationship between the child and parent. There's no abuse, neglect, or seriously deficient parenting on the part of the rejected parent. The favored parent uses multiple alienating types of behaviors. We'll be touching on that a little more in a few minutes. And the child exhibits many of the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation, which we'll also touch on. We have a case now in our office where we represent dad, 2 children, and our client is being accused of engaging in parental alienation. Of course, we take the allegation very seriously, but when we look at the 5 factors and the other factors, which are going to be up on the screen shortly, while we're not doing a checklist, just the overall impression is that there are problems with the mom and the teenage daughter. They have problems, and the teenage daughter has 15, I believe, maybe 16, has rejected the equal shared parenting arrangement. And those of you who know me know that I am and Brian, we are both very big advocates of a rebuttable presumption in favor of equal shared parenting. Thankfully, it looks like Dr. Barbara Jo Fiddler is going to be involved to help that out. Is it a case of parental alienation? We say not. It isn't. But there is a problem in the relationship. So we have to be careful as lawyers, as therapists, as judges, arbitrators, mediators, where there is rejection or reluctance or resist-refuse dynamic, it may be the result of parental alienation, but it may not. Brian, I think you were going to discuss slide number 4.
Okay, so the way we should be, and this will be just one short comment. Just because we're going to label something as here's the primary factor in a family does not mean we stop, we give up. Because the goal, no matter what the diagnosis of the family dysfunction is for the kids to exit childhood with healthy, bonded relationships with 2 parents and 2 extended families. So if somebody has strayed into letting their personal feelings get in the way and they're alienating, we don't just say, well, that's the diagnosis, so you're done. There's interventions that are scientifically based to turn that around, to give the kids back to healthy relationships. Same thing if it's a mixed bag and both parents are really acting in unhelpful ways, or it's primarily one parent who maybe they're too rigid, they're too demanding, they're doing old school parenting, and they need to dampen that down and move toward the middle. No matter what the causality is, it's to help the family do better, help the family to restructure in a healthy fashion. And somehow that gets lost in the war over what is the primary causal factor. Sometimes you say to yourself when you're litigating these cases, does it really matter? Let's turn our back on the past, look at the future, craft a new family constitution, and let a therapist guide us in terms of the friction points. How can we do better and stop fighting about the past and give the children 2 healthy relationships? That's the point of this slide.
My turn?
Yep, please.
This slide and the next one give us 17 bad parental behaviors. I'm not going to read out the 17 behaviors. They're up there on the screen. You will find this particular list comes from the World Parents Organization, as the slide indicates, but you will find in the case law, some of which Brian has already referred to, you will find many of these behaviors described. Let me put forward a cautionary note here. Case precedents in Canada do indeed talk about proving parental alienation. I suggest that this is a mistaken approach. In any particular case, I submit that the focus should be not on proving PA as such. Rather, in my view, the correct approach is to describe the favored parent's behaviors and the child's behaviors. Then propose solutions to the child's resistance to father contact. You should not feel bound to actually prove PA, as I'm saying. Rather, demonstrate that there is a problem here through evidence, whether that's in court, whether that's with an arbitrator, whatever the form is, simply demonstrate there's a problem here. And more important than, not more important, equally important to demonstrating that there's a problem, demonstrate, propose a realistic plan to fix it. Not every judge, arbitrator, custody assessor, parenting assessor, therapist, mediator, etc., has a full understanding of the complicated family dynamics that we find in children who are estranged from their dads, who refuse contact with formerly beloved fathers and extended paternal families, and often extending even to the formerly favored pet, dog, cat, whatever. Believe it or not, just proving PA has the real potential, in my view, to get you nowhere, almost nowhere. On the other hand, I maintain that what you need to do is describe the objectionable behaviors and then propose solutions that are tailored to the individual child and to the particular fractured family. I've said the same thing about 2 or 3 different ways. Thank you for bearing with me, my friends. Want to get that message across. In the process, by proving the behaviors, putting forward a realistic plan of treatment, you'll have essentially proved PA. I think it's even preferable, if you can, not even to mention the word. Yes, of course, you give the case precedents and the social science resources. And Brian, through his links on this PowerPoint, which will be somehow made available to you all, has provided a cornucopia of resources in that respect. Now, we talked about the, where are we on slide number 7? Yes. The behavioral signs in the child. And again, here, though this is from the WPO, you'll find these repeated in the cases, references that Brian gives on the links to our presentation this morning. Got the 8 behavioral signs in the child. Just a second. Just bear with me a moment. Okay. So you've got denigration, child often repeating what the favored parent says in the favored parent's own terms, in adult terms, often not in child terms. absurd rationalizations for the child's rejection of a parent. You show alienated children a picture of them having a good time with dad, and they'll tell the therapist, or they'll tell the custody assessor, "Oh, I was just faking." Common response: "I was just faking that. I wasn't really happy there." You've got a lack of ambivalence regarding the father. Like, it's all good. Mom is all good, dad is all bad. Then you got the fourth, the independent thinker phenomenon. You know, just my decision. Nonsense. Absence of any guilt. No guilt, no empathy at all for the non-favored parent, like not a hint. Reflexive support of the favored parent, presence of borrowed scenarios, i.e. making accusations about the rejected parent that use phrases and ideas adopted from the favored parent, and of course rejection of the father's extended family. Now, often I use father here on this as rejected parent. We're at a conference, men and families, so I've approached it from that way, but women, moms, can certainly be the subject, the victims of parental alienation.
Okay, I just want to amplify one or two things that Jean was speaking to in terms of patterns. It's pattern recognition. Those lists, which are the scientifically validated lists, are born of a lot of study over decades. And you don't see those sorts of behaviors generally in families that are kind of fracturing for other reasons. So they're quite indicative. But one thing on the kids saying that they were forced to smile or wasn't a genuine smile in pictures, we see in these cases is children refusing to participate in pictures and running out of the camera phone range if they see the estranged parent just trying to take a picture of them, because the other parent have said, don't let the other parent take pictures of you because they'll use it to show that you actually love them. So you never see that behavior but for in artificially alienated children. So it's pattern recognition. You see this stuff happening time after time. Okay, so Jean's already made the point that we can't jump to conclusions. The family systems are very complex, and we need to do a differential diagnosis. Well, there are other conceptualizations of harmful behavior where it's still the parent that the layperson would say, my kids want nothing to do with me, it's the other parent's fault, it's a parental alienation case. Well, the first two observations could be fine, but it's not a parental alienation case. There's some other dynamic that's going on that's interfering with your relationship with the children. Some examples of other diagnoses where one parent is still the primary causal factor, but it's not alienation. The children don't hate or unjustifiably fear and have racking anxiety about the rejected parent. Those are the most two common variants. The first one, point one on this slide, is enmeshment, which is a concept well known in the psychological world. if you look at a continuum of how children are bonded with parents, it is a falsity to say, wow, look at those two. They're like two peas in a pod. They're joined at the hip. They finish each other's sentences. That's a wonderful parent-child relationship. That would be very wrong. That's not a normal, healthy parent-child relationship. There has to be some differentiation there. Children, even from a relatively young age, need to establish and be given the room to establish their own personality, their own views. So yes, you can be too close. And if you're in an enmeshed relationship, the other parent will forever be on the outside looking in. But it's an enmeshment case to be diagnosed in accordance, and it is horrible for child development. And there's jurisprudence about the dangers of enmeshment. But don't try and prove an alienation case. There's jurisprudence at the link on this slide. And there's one of the best articles ever written that describes the broader concept of boundary dissolution and explains what it is, what it looks like, and what the harm is to children. So if your case involves enmeshment, or maybe enmeshment with a touch of alienation, make sure to focus on these concepts, because the favored parent is going to need a lot of help to learn to allow the children to separate and differentiate. Point 2. Sometimes it's not alienation and it's not enmeshment. It's just a power and control thing. These children are mine, they're my property, and I will dictate when and how you see them. It's too painful for me to be away from my children for even a moment. So I'm going to just dole it out with an eyedropper. I'm the primary parent and I determine the parenting plan. We call that gatekeeping. No one parent has the right, because children are not your property. They're independent beings and they're vulnerable. Gatekeeping is extremely harmful. One of the leading cases on gatekeeping, Justice McGee, very senior judge, is at the link in item 2, and an article about how we assess and the impact of gatekeeping is at the second link. So what about point 3? It's not an alienation case. It's not an enmeshment case. It's not a gatekeeping case, even though the output, what we are observing, looks the same. Child wants very little to do with one parent. Is there something else? Well, you'll often hear this is a very anxious child. And that's the reason why the child isn't just simply going back and forth and back and forth. Very anxious child. Too much for this paper and this presentation to go there. Suffice it to say that's wrong, but now you're into an area where you probably do need some professional expertise to refute those arguments. Lastly, what if the cause is simply children who have learned to have their cake and eat it too? I'm going to continually play one parent off against the other parent. If I don't get something in one house, I'll get it in the other house, and that will force the first house to give me that as well. And if I don't like some discipline or some advice that I've gotten in one house, I'll use the other house as the court of appeal. That is remarkably common. Children figure out the power dynamic in the family, and this is what they do. And so, as Jean said, you target the remedy to the actual problem in the family system. And obviously, there are parental rules and guidance. Maybe we add a parental coordinator. We try and get the parenting in the two homes One could be overly permissive, just like you can be overly close and enmeshed. The other house could be normal, but hey, it's time to relax some of those rules and boundaries and dial it down and meet the children somewhere in the middle, because it's very hard for children to go from one house where the bedtime is 8 p.m. to the other house where there is no bedtime, and back and forth and back and forth, all kinds of problems. So this slide, therefore, cautions us. Don't jump to any conclusions when you see fractured relationships. Really try and figure out the particularities. And when we study the possible reasons, of course, we break it down into these categories, but very often it's a mixture. And therefore, you need some remedies for enmeshment and some remedies for gatekeeping and some remedies for alienation. You need to equalize the children's experience in the two homes. And so it's a very target-rich and detailed response. So, Jean, back over to you. Oh, I think I was meant to do this one. Okay. So I said before that just because we label, we find, here's the label that describes what's going on in this family, that determines the result. It's never that easy. That, you know, we often have judges who don't really understand saying, I do not find that this is a pure case of alienation. Wrong question. What's the primary factor or factors? You don't have to prove that the targeted parent is perfect, never made a mistake, never had a bad day, because that doesn't exist. And in one of the slides to come, I'm going to show you a couple of cases that show you that even where the targeted parent has made some mistakes, the court is still going to find PA is a primary causal factor because nobody can actually meet the test of a pure PA case. Similarly, if we were to conclude that, wow, you know, my gosh, your parenting is so harsh. Maybe that worked in the 40s, but today, kids are going to rebel against that, and whatever the other parent's doing, we could get them to stop, and your kids are still not going to like being with you. We got to deal with your contribution first. Doesn't mean, well, that's it. Kids don't have to see you because after all, you have overly harsh parenting. We understand why they don't want to see you. No, the job is always to fix it, to get the two healthy, happy families. So everything should be fixable with assistance, family therapists, parental coordinators, the court, two good lawyers involved, if you want to fix it. So alienation versus estrangement or justified rejection is a false binary. It tells you nothing. You still have a job to fix and give the children two healthy relationships. Okay, Jean, next slide. So ambivalence. So, well, it's not a PA case because the child doesn't hate the other parent. There's no attraction there for them. They're just ambivalent. So it's not a PA case. Wrong. You should be more afraid of ambivalence than hatred. Hatred, or maybe not hatred, but anger. Anger is a call for help. There's friction here. Come help me solve it. I'm trying to create some attention. Ambivalence or disinterest means there's no love. There's no attachment in the psychological sense. And that means this relationship will not survive childhood. So ambivalence is as scary and concerning as parental alienation or child abuse, not to be dismissed.
But Brian, I don't think you disagree with me. Let's just make it clear. that if we have a child that is simply ambivalent about spending time with dad, we'll say, ambivalent about it, and we don't see any of the other characteristics that we've discussed this morning, it may be bad for the child and bad for the parent, but PA it is not.
Correct. It is not PA. There's something else going on because children are genetically programmed to love. It's just built into who they are. Children are genetically built to take in caregivers. If you have someone who says, I love you, I want to contribute to your life, I enjoy being with you, I enjoy hanging with my own child, and the child is like, I don't get anything out of it. It's extremely concerning. It's not a parental alienation case, but there's something going on that has interfered with the natural order of affairs that needs to be tackled. It's concerning, is my point. Okay, so this is what I alluded to before, and then after this slide, Gene and I will be wrapping up.
Brian, before we get into slide number 11, amazing. We have until 11:30, and we're going to finish in a few minutes. So therefore, I want to let everyone know online and also in the Rosedale room that Brian and I are open to taking questions. For those online, you can place them in the chat. I will monitor that. And one of the conference coordinator students will get you to a microphone, make sure it's a live microphone, and hopefully we can hear and take your questions from the Rosedale room. Okay, Brian's now going to address slide number 11.
Okay, so thanks for that, Gene. It's very rare that two people with as much to say and experience as Gene and myself finish early. It's almost unheard of, but I think we were both consciously trying to move this along because you never know till you get down to the last couple of slides how you're doing. So there's some really good insights here that maybe I'll just linger just a touch to amplify. Okay, so remember that when Dr. Gardner started to do his studies of why somebody who was such a good child psychologist was unable to help certain families. And like all scientific studies, you look for the patterns. How do I tell in advance almost what these families look like that I can't help? And if I could figure out what the factors are, it's almost like a medical diagnosis. What's going on? What is in common in those families that a very experienced clinician cannot help? They don't want the help. They won't change. They won't improve. They won't settle down. What is it about it? And which is where Dr. Gardner's construct came from, not the broader observation of human behavior, which, as I say, goes back 200 years. So Dr. Gardner's work is taking place in the mid to late 80s. And Canada already had some jurisprudence on these fractured families. But one of the earliest cases that actually focused on Dr. Gardner's work is a 1991 Superior Court decision. You won't find it posted anywhere, but I have a copy of the decision and it's available at the link that says Montreal 1991. It is in English. And when you read it 32 to 33 years later, it has the most remarkable insights succinctly stated about what is going on in these families. textbook, and it's 32 to 33 years ago. And compared to some of the decisions that Jean and I are getting these days, 50 pages, 60 pages, because of how complex these family histories are, this one does it succinctly, but covers all the ground, all the elements. Now, it was upheld on appeal at the publicly available link on Canley, but kind of on other grounds. Father didn't really pursue the father was the alienating parent in this case, didn't really pursue the appeal properly. So we're really left with the Superior Court decision. So a couple of years ago, I'm doing my morning reading and I see there's an obituary for Justice John Gomery, who wrote the PSM case. And I'd use this case very frequently because of its succinct observations, including, for example, this one. Justice Gomery observes, hatred is not an emotion that comes naturally to children. It has to be taught. So I've used that piece of judicial rhetoric very frequently. But the case is filled with these sorts of amazing observations. And so at the time I was writing, and then I got too busy, I'll have to get back to it. I was writing the legal column for the bi-monthly publication of the PSG called Parental Alienation International. So I said, well, there's my topic for this edition. And so I wrote this article called Remembering Justice Gomery, and it's available at this link on the page. And essentially what I did is I took all the elements of the case, related it to our latest 30-something years later understanding of these dynamics, and showed how he was ahead of his time, and this decision is still mandatory reading today. A lot of his conclusions and observations were only scientifically validated a decade and a half later. That's how good this was. And interestingly, Justice Gomery's daughter, Sally Gomery, is a Superior Court judge, I think, in Ottawa. So hopefully this was my legacy to the Gomery family. But if you read it, and this goes back to Jean's point about what if the rejected parent, has some rough spots in their parenting. Well, one of the amazing insights in this case is that the mother did have some rough spots. Bit of a temper, bit reactive, certainly various incidents where she'd like a do-over and could have done better. But the primary causal factor was still parental alienation. And so this case is very helpful because we know there's no perfect targeted parents in the same way that there's no perfect favorite parents. And so often the strategy, if you are defending a parental alienation case, is to throw spaghetti and mud at the wall, see what sticks, and say, see, it's not a pure PA case. The rejected parent could have been much better also. Well, the PSM case demonstrates that that's a false dichotomy. You don't have to be perfect to have your kids still love you. If they don't, there's something much more forceful, dark, and sinister going on. Now, the second case at point 3, where I was involved actually acting for the mother who had been accused of alienation, the father's parenting was rigid, unyielding. He wanted the children not to be communicating with the mother during his parenting time. It was a very difficult environment for the children. And a short-term protective separation from the mother was still ordered, despite those difficulties on the part of the father. Now, there's a backstory there that I'm not at liberty really to share, but once again, just like the PSM case, targeted parents don't have to be perfect. It's important to bear that in mind. And here's two cases that say that, but the takeaways from the 1991 case, I really urge everybody, download and read this piece that I wrote, Remembering Justice Gomery, and you'll see what I mean. We should always remember this particular case, and for some of the other reasons that I won't give people the last chapter, but it's in the article. Okay, Gene, our conclusions?
Yeah, Brian, first, thank you very much, Brian. I'm glad we had the time for you to focus on Justice Gomery. He was an exceptional justice all the way around. And I think your talk about him and your article, which I've read at least once, not more times, on him, is wonderful tributes to his memory and his ongoing legacy. Brian, if you want to say some concluding remarks before the questions, we have a couple of questions in the chat, which I will put to you and I.
Sure, just one thing for those helping targeted parents, or if you are a targeted parent, this is one of the most difficult journeys out there. It's both a marathon and a sprint at the same time. Very hard to do it alone. The successful cases often involve, there's a new partner who is supporting the targeted parent. There's great support from extended family and friends. There's a really good therapist / parenting coach for the targeted parent. You can't walk this path alone. It's too difficult. You need to pull in. There are support groups. There's books to read. It goes on and on and on. You must have the supports to survive one of these journeys.
If you have not yet read Dr. Richard Warshak's book, Divorce Poison, 2nd edition, I highly recommend it. Available on Amazon or wherever. It's a wonderful book. It doesn't take too long to read. It has tons of common sense. Dr. Warshak is a psychologist in Texas, and Brian and I have both used him on cases that we've been involved in. In fact, if you go to my website, go to the photo section, you have a nice picture of Dr. Warshak, Brian, and me out for dinner, pre-COVID. Brian, you talked just now about the resources that it takes to withstand a PA case, a resist refuse case. And what troubles me is that for those victims of PA that don't have their own financial resources or the family financial resources, it's so difficult to get to the stage even of a motion, never mind a trial, of a motion, and trying perhaps using the principles that we've laid out and the resources that you kindly provide in your links here in this PowerPoint, Brian. Very, very difficult. I don't know what the solution for that is, but I do recognize it.